continue on into some discussion of um, of the kinds of tactics that you all have found effective in trying to mobilize in spite of the repression, and how the police have and other security forces have also modified their tactics, and what has worked for you and what factors are working against you.
So in Canada, we have a new constitution that came in 1982 that recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights. The problem is the courts and the governments have unilaterally interpreted, the meaning or the scope and content of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Constitution. They have narrow policies, land claims policies, which date back to 1973. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, it's his father who was Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He's the one that brought in the land claims policies in the 1970s. And Justin Trudeau is implementing his father's land claims policies. It's also Justin Trudeau's father who brought in the new constitution, which recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights, but, is doing so in a narrow way defined by the courts and by government policies for negotiation. When Indigenous peoples stand up to oppose pipelines, hydro, dams, mega dams, mining projects, forestry, clear cutting, there's many, many issues that are affecting Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lands in Canada. And particularly when Indigenous peoples stand up to the oil and gas industry in Canada, the energy policies of Canada, the intelligence agencies get involved. So it's not just the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is the national police agency, but also the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. They institute a spying system and start in developing individual profiles on Indigenous activists, land defenders. And they put that into a database. And they've had a number of joint intelligence operations in Canada where they coordinated with the police to target Indigenous activists for arrest. And it is a pretty sophisticated system in Canada because, when you go and try and oppose a development project like a pipeline or a mine, something like that, the burden of proof is on the Indigenous group to prove that they have an Aboriginal treaty right. And it costs millions and millions of dollars to collect the historical and cultural evidence to meet the legal tests that the courts have set out in Canada. So it's an unfair burden because most communities cannot afford to enter into the judicial process under these legal tests that the court has imposed defining these Aboriginal treaty rights. And because they're, the police agencies are basically acting as a political arm of the government, Indigenous peoples have had to form national networks like the Defenders of the Land Network and I Don't Know More, another political social movement in Canada, and using social media to link up and do national actions. In fact, in February, when in British Columbia, when the RCMP went in and invaded Wet'suwet'en and removed them off their own territory by force, the response for support actions across Canada with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples basically shut down the country. They shut down the railroads. There were actions right across the country in response to what the government did to the Wet'suwet'en, which of course violates, minimum international standards, even like Article 10 of the UN Declaration. But the other problem is Canada has come up with a Canadian definition of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And they want to put that into law by December. They want to put that into Parliament. And what they want to do is pass a law that's going to impose that Canadian definition of the UN Declaration. And again, the UN, it's based on domestic law. And they don't recognize free, prior, informed consent in Canada. They recognize, according to the courts, a lower duty or standard called the duty to consult and accommodate. And like I said, that's all based on being able to prove evidence of what they call a strength of claim. They do an analysis of a strength of claim. And if you're at a low end of that, they do a depth of consultation analysis where they decide they only have to give you a notice, that they're going to build a mine or a pipeline or something that they don't. If you're able to prove you have Aboriginal title, then that's what they call deep consultation. And even then, the court has said there's potential Aboriginal title and established Aboriginal title. And the courts have said in Canada that to establish Aboriginal title, there's two ways. You either get a declaration from the court, which again costs millions and millions of dollars for the evidence, or you negotiate under their land claims policy, which is based on extinguishment of Aboriginal title and replacement of new rights to surrender to Crown sovereignty. And like I said, the assertion of Crown sovereignty is based on this doctrine of discovery, this planting a flag by European powers like the British. Even though they made many treaties in Canada, historic treaties, they've ignored them and, used the police basically to remove Indigenous peoples from any major project or activity that the federal government or the provincial governments want to see developed. And even in British Columbia, the last thing I'll say, in British Columbia, they passed a law last November to implement the UN declaration called Bill 41, the Declaration Act. And it was after that in British Columbia that they invaded and removed the Wet'suwet'en. And the premier, that's the head of the government of British Columbia, was asked, well, how can you do that after you pass this law saying you're going to implement the UN declaration? And he said, well, the law is forward-looking, it's not retrospective. So in other words, it's not recognizing all of the existing infrastructure and colonizations that's occurred in British Columbia for, almost a century and a half. So in Canada, that's the situation we have. It's not just the police, but it's the intelligence services that are cooperating together to identify individuals and try to arrest them and to break up movements from organizing in Canada. Thank you.